It was the kind of cold that settled into a man's bones and never left. January of 1874 clawed ferociously at the hills of Hardin County, Kentucky, where the Dalton homestead stood alone against the gray sky. To most who passed by, and if anyone ever did, it looked ordinary. A two-story farmhouse curved slightly by time, its windows black and unwelcoming, its fields lying barren under frost. But there was something about it, something that pressed on the chest of every soul who dared glance too long. The locals said the soil there felt wrong, heavy, almost mournful. They didn't know how right they were. Henry Dalton built that house with his own hands 18 years earlier, back when his name meant respect and not fear. He had come from Ohio after the war, seeking quiet land to raise his family. What he found instead was hardship, bad harvests, sickness, debt, and a temper that grew like rot inside him. Henry wasn't an evil man, at least not at first. He was proud, stubborn, and weary from a world that never gave him grace. His wife, Margaret, had known that temper from the early years. The shouting, the slammed doors, the nights when she'd hide bruises beneath lace and long sleeves. Yet she stayed out of duty, out of faith, out of a hope that men might change. But by 1874, everyone in town knew that hope had long since died. The Daltons had 4 children once. Only 3 remained by that winter. William, the eldest, barely 20, and already carrying the bitterness of a man twice his age. Robert, 17, quiet and strong, the kind whose eyes always seemed to be watching something nobody else could see. And Clara, the youngest, 8 years old, her laughter the last bright sound that still dared echo through those dark walls. That laugh would soon fall silent too. The day before the massacre, Henry rode into Elizabethtown in a fury. The drought had ruined his harvest again, and his debts had become impossible to ignore. At the grain exchange he demanded credit, shouting over the clerk's refusals, until the sheriff himself asked him to leave. Witnesses recalled his words as he stormed out into the snow. If they want blood for payment, they'll have it. No one took him seriously then. They should have. He returned home before sunset, his horse slick with frost, his face drawn and red from drink. The house smelled of sickness when he entered. Margaret's fever had worsened. She lay in bed, trembling beneath a quilt, whispering prayers no one listened to anymore. The boys were outside chopping wood, their breath forming ghosts in the cold. When Henry barked for them to come in, his voice cracked through the distance like a whip. They obeyed. But there was something in the way William looked at him, a defiance born from years of silence. Henry noticed it too. Supper that night was a tense ceremony of half-spoken words. The stew was thin, the bread stale. Henry's spoon clinked against the bowl like a ticking clock. He accused William of stealing money, Margaret of sympathy, and even little Clara of staring too much. Words turned to shouting, shouting to pounding fists against the wooden table. Margaret tried to calm him, to steer him away from the edge. But that night the edge was all he saw. He struck her. It wasn't the first time, but it would be the last. William rose to his feet, rage flaring in his chest. He grabbed his father's arm before another blow could land. "Enough," he said. Just one word, but it carried years of buried hatred. Henry froze for a moment, disbelieving his own son's defiance. Then the room erupted. Chairs crashed, dishes shattered. Robert lunged in, trying to pull them apart. Clara screamed, running to her mother. The storm inside the Dalton house swallowed every sound but rage. No one knew what truly happened after that moment. Nobody survived to tell the story firsthand. But when dawn came, the frost around the Dalton homestead had turned pink. The first to arrive was a traveling peddler named Amos Carter. He'd passed their road dozens of times before, but that morning something caught his eye. Smoke rising thin and crooked from the chimney. Too faint for a warming fire. Too strange for comfort, he called out as he approached, his boots crunching the ice. "Mr. Dalton?" Silence. The front door hung slightly open, as if reluctant to reveal what waited behind it. When Amos pushed it wider, a sour stench of iron filled his nose. The house was dim, the fire nearly dead. On the floor near the hearth was Clara's doll, its dress torn, one glass eye missing. His stomach tightened. He stepped further inside and saw the overturned table, the broken plates, the trail of blood that wove from the kitchen to the stairs. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to leave, but some heavy instinct kept him moving. Upstairs he found them, or what was left of them. Margaret and Clara lay together on the bed, their faces still, their skin pale as wax. The sheets beneath them were soaked dark, frozen stiff in places. The boys were in the hall nearby, as if they'd fought to reach the door. William's hand still clutched a small hunting knife, useless against the rifle that had cut him down. And Henry? Henry was at the far end of the room, slumped against the wall, a shotgun between his knees, his head bowed forward. One side of his face gone, Amos stumbled back into the snow, screaming for help that didn't come soon enough. By noon, half the county had gathered outside the Dalton home, farmers, deputies, and preachers, all standing in mute disbelief. None could explain the madness that had unfolded within those walls, and perhaps none wanted to. The sheriff declared it murder-suicide. The preacher called it possession of the spirit. The neighbors whispered it was the curse of the land itself, too much blood spilled from war and hunger. But the truth was simpler and far colder. It was the story of a man crushed by pride, a wife drained by fear, and children caught between both, trapped in a house that had long forgotten tenderness. The Dalton homestead became a place people avoided. Years turned. The roof sagged, the doors warped, the crops grew wild again. Yet those who passed on still nights swore they heard something through the wind, and not ghosts, but echoes of what fury and despair can do to a family built on silence. Long after the sheriff sealed the case, the bloodstains remained. The boards were scrubbed, the walls whitewashed, but faint marks bled through every coat of paint. Even decades later, farmers who tried to rebuild swore the stains would return after every rainfall, seeping slowly through the wood like time refusing to heal. They called it the night the walls bled. Others called it judgment. Either way it lingered, a scar on Hardin County's memory. By spring, the Dalton farm was abandoned for good. Crows nested in the rafters. The wind moaned through the empty windows. Travelers sometimes stopped to stare, drawn by curiosity or unease, and always left faster than they arrived. No one ever plowed that land again. The soil, some said, never gave back what it took. And so the Dalton homestead stood, silent and hollow, a monument to everything that could go wrong behind closed doors. The day Henry's rage met despair, history turned its gaze on a small farmhouse at the edge of Kentucky, a place where love lost its battle against vengeance, where silence screamed louder than any prayer. Years later, when locals told the story around fires on dark winter nights, they'd lower their voices as the wind rattled the eaves, and someone would inevitably whisper the same words that began every retelling. Do you remember the night the Dalton walls bled? And in that moment, every flicker of flame seemed to bend closer, listening, as if the walls themselves were waiting to hear their own story told again. The Dalton murders spread across Hardin County, like frost devouring a field. Within a day, the story reached Elizabethtown, then spread to Louisville, whispered first in saloons and then printed in the papers. The ink barely dried before the questions began. Why had no one seen it coming? Was it madness or something else entirely? The press called it the Dalton tragedy, a name too soft for the shadows it left behind. Sheriff Grant Morgan was the one forced to face it head-on. A man in his 50s with more patience than faith, he'd seen his share of violence, drunken brawls, land disputes gone bad, even a few killings, but nothing like what waited inside that farmhouse. He arrived just after noon, stepping down from his horse as silence hung heavy over the gathering crowd. The townsfolk parted to let him through, their faces pale against the bitter wind. At first glance, the Dalton house looked almost peaceful. The snow had begun to cover the tracks, softening the violence. But the sheriff smelled it immediately, the sickly blend of smoke, blood, and decay. He took off his hat and crossed the threshold, his boots creaking across the warped floorboards. Amos Carter waited near the door, shivering, unable to meet Grant's eyes. The sheriff gave him a nod and climbed the stairs. He found them just as Amos had said. The scene froze him where he stood. Jesus, he muttered, the word barely forming. Margaret and Clara lay together, as though she had tried to shield her daughter at the last breath. The boys, still in the hallway, looked like they had fought not only their father, but fate itself. Henry's body, slouched in the corner, told the rest of the story. The gun, the blood, the silence afterward, it all spoke in grim detail. But something about it felt wrong to Sheriff Morgan. The angle of the wounds, the spatter on the far wall, details that didn't fit the neat story of a drunken father gone mad. He said nothing to the men outside, not yet. He stayed in that house long after everyone else left, walking from room to room, studying what the dead had left behind. The overturned chair, the burn marks on the kitchen wall, the unlocked back door. He noticed footprints leading into the barn, too fresh for the weather. He followed them, lantern raised. Inside the barn he found signs of struggle, hay scattered, a rope torn from its hook, and blood staining the snow just beyond the threshold. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell him the truth might be deeper and darker than anyone wanted to believe. That night, Hardin County didn't sleep. The church bell tolled for the dead, its sound carried by the wind to every home for miles. Margaret and the children were buried the next day in the small cemetery behind the Baptist church. Henry was placed further off beyond the fence line, not out of spite, but because some said the ground refused him. The preacher performed his duty, though his voice trembled when he spoke Henry's name. In the following weeks, the story refused to die. Some claimed Henry's debts had driven him insane. Others whispered of bandits or a family feud gone unseen. Sheriff Morgan visited every farm for 10 miles, interviewing neighbors and collecting fragments of rumor. But none of it settled the unease gnawing at him. There had been 2 sets of footprints that night, one large, heavy, clearly Henry's, the other smaller, lighter and gone before morning. On a cold February morning, Morgan returned once more to the Dalton farm. Snow had melted just enough to reveal what winter had hidden. Near the barn, behind a collapsed fence post, he found a partial print preserved in ice, a shoe, not a boot, slimmer than a farmer would wear. And nearby, buried under hay, a piece of torn fabric, blue wool expensive by local standards. Whoever had been there that night wasn't from Hardin County. That realization sent a chill through him deeper than the weather. Later he learned from a merchant in Elizabethtown that Henry had argued not only with the grain clerk, but also with a man from Louisville, a collector named Everett Langston, who'd been pressing him for payment on a shipment of faulty seed. The merchant claimed Henry had shouted he'd settle it himself before storming off. The sheriff now wondered if Langston had followed him back. Still, no proof surfaced, and after a month the town grew weary of ghosts. The Dalton farm remained abandoned, its windows dark, its doors creaking in the wind. Children dared each other to approach, but none crossed the threshold. Some said on still nights you could hear a faint knocking from inside. Others swore it was only loose wood and imagination. Sheriff Morgan, though, couldn't forget what he'd seen, or that print frozen in the snow. By early spring he rode to Louisville to confront Langston himself. The city was a far cry from the quiet hills. Streetcars rattling, smoke pouring from chimneys, people moving with purpose. Morgan found Langston's office above a hardware store. The man was slick and pale, his suit pressed, his eyes cold and watchful. When the sheriff mentioned Henry's name, Langston stiffened. He admitted to seeing him, yes, but denied following him home. "Why would I waste a day on a man already ruined?" he sneered. Yet something in his voice rang false. Morgan left the office unsettled. On his way out, a clerk slipped him a folded note saying it had been left for someone asking questions about the Dalton case. Inside, written in a hurried hand, was a single line. "Ask who came to the farm after Henry." No name. No signature. Only that. That night Morgan couldn't sleep. He sat by his lantern, staring at the evidence he'd brought back. The cloth, the report, the copy of the coroner's notes. A theory began forming in his mind, fragile but possible. What if Henry hadn't killed them all? What if he'd returned home to find something already wrong? Someone else inside? If true, it meant the Dalton case wasn't a family tragedy, but a cover-up of something far more deliberate. Unfortunately, by spring, the county wanted the story buried. The preacher stopped speaking of it. The papers turned to new scandals, and the Dalton land was quietly sold to a lumber company. By summer, the house stood half-burned, deliberately set alight to clear space. The fire should have ended it, but witnesses later swore the flames wouldn't catch on certain walls. Where the stains had been, the boards only blackened, refusing to crumble. Even Ash, it seemed, did not want to touch what had happened there. When Morgan stood before the ruins that July, he felt a rare thing: fear. Not of spirits, but of human cruelty, its ability to disguise itself, to linger long after flesh had turned to soil. Somewhere in that smouldering mess was the truth, half buried and half forgotten. He turned away and mounted his horse, the embers crackling behind him as if whispering goodbye. Years later, he would retire without ever closing the file. But he kept one thing from that winter, the piece of blue wool folded neatly in his desk. As the story faded from memory, and the Dalton name became a cautionary tale told by candlelight, he would sometimes open his drawer, look at that fabric, and wonder if justice had ever truly been done. Because deep down, Sheriff Morgan knew one thing the papers never printed. On the morning of the massacre, there had been 6 sets of footprints leading into the Dalton homestead, and only 5 bodies found inside. The spring rains came hard that year, washing over the Kentucky hills and blurring the grave markers behind St. Andrew's Church. By April, most of Hardin County had moved on, or at least pretended to. But not Sheriff Grant Morgan. He couldn't shake the memory. The blood, the prints, the silence that clung to those rooms. Every night he replayed it in his head, like a story half-finished and missing its final line. One evening, he sat at the only tavern in Elizabethtown, staring into his drink, when a stranger took the seat across from him. The man's coat was blue, deep, fine wool, the kind you didn't often see outside of Louisville. He introduced himself as Matthew Crow, a trader passing through, though his manner was too polished, his words too careful. "You were the one handled that Dalton business, weren't you, Sheriff?" he asked, voice smooth as glass. When Morgan confirmed, Crow smiled faintly. "Terrible thing. Shame Henry lost his mind like that." Morgan kept his face steady, though his mind churned. He hadn't mentioned Henry's name. "You knew him?" he asked. Crow shrugged. "Barely. Bought feed from him once. Good man, proud man. Desperate men make poor choices." Then, leaning closer, he added, "You still think he did it?" The question caught Morgan by surprise. He studied Crow's eyes, gray, unreadable, like river stones. "I don't think," the sheriff replied. "I follow facts," Crow smirked. "And what do your facts tell you?" Morgan didn't answer. But when the man stood to leave, the sheriff noticed something as Crow reached for his hat. A faint tear in the hem of his coat, along the shoulder seam. A small gap in the stitching, exposing a bit of frayed fabric. Blue wool. Exactly the same texture as the fragment folded in Morgan's desk drawer. He didn't speak of it, not then. He simply watched as Crow tipped his hat, stepping out into the rain, disappearing into the growing darkness. That night, Morgan's instincts screamed louder than reason. The Dalton case wasn't over. Over the following weeks, the sheriff quietly began to watch Crow's movements. The stranger seemed to have no fixed home, yet never stayed far from town. He rented a small room above a shuttered post office, paid in cash, came and went at odd hours. He claimed to trade farm supplies, but no one could recall him selling or delivering anything. Morgan learned he often rode east, returning days later with mud-caked boots and tired eyes. One night in late May, Morgan followed him. He kept his horse at distance along the winding rural roads, letting moonlight guide the way. Crow stopped not far from the burned shell of the Dalton homestead. He dismounted, walked toward the remains, and stood there for a long time, unmoving, as if listening. Even from a distance, Morgan felt unease crawl up his neck. Then Crow knelt down near what had once been the front steps. When he finally rode off, Morgan moved in. The ashes were cold, but footprints marked the ground, one set only. Near the prints, half buried in soot, he found something glinting faintly. Bending down, he picked it up, a brass cufflink, engraved with the initials E.L. Everett Langston. Suddenly, everything realigned. The argument over the grain, the note left in the office, the footprints. Langston, the collector from Louisville, had either sent Crow or worked with him. But to what end? To scare Henry? To punish him? The Dalton homestead had become the execution ground for a debt unpaid, and in the process, 4 innocent lives were taken. The next morning, Morgan rode hard to Louisville with the cufflink in his coat pocket. He went straight to Langston's office, but found it empty. A dusty sign on the door read, "Closed for business." According to the landlord, Langston had vanished weeks earlier without notice, leaving rent unpaid. His assistant, a timid young woman, admitted he'd spoken often with a Mr. Crow, though she hadn't seen either man since February. Back in Elizabethtown, Morgan tracked Crow to his rented room, but by then it too had been cleared out. The bed unmade, the trunk gone. The only thing left behind was a scrap of newspaper pasted to the wall. It was an article from January, the story of the Dalton murders. Someone had circled a single line in black ink. The incident marks one of the most brutal family slayings in Hardin County's history. Beneath it, 3 words scrawled in pencil: debt repaid completely. Sheriff Morgan stood there for a long while, the words echoing in his mind. Every lead had turned to smoke. Langston gone. Crow vanished. Even the house itself reduced to ash. But something told him the story hadn't ended. Not truly. Weeks passed. Summer came. Then August brought a heat wave that made the air itself shimmer. On the 10th of the month, a group of farmers arrived in town, breathless and pale. They'd found a wagon overturned along the river trail, one horse dead, the other missing. In the mud nearby lay a body, half submerged and bloated from the sun. The clothes were fine. The coat was blue. Morgan rode out immediately. The corpse had been there for days, maybe weeks, the face unrecognizable. But when he turned the man's wrist, he saw a faint scar, a straight line like from a burn. He remembered seeing that same mark on Crow's hand the night they spoke at the tavern. The sheriff ordered the body buried quietly at the edge of the churchyard, marked only as unknown. He told no one what he suspected. That evening, while filing his report, Morgan unfolded the old piece of blue wool from the Dalton case and laid it beside the dead man's sleeve. A perfect match. He stared for a long time, the lamplight flickering. In his gut, he knew the truth. Crow had been part of it all. Maybe not the only one, but one of them. And whatever justice he'd met out there by the river, it came too late for the Daltons. But the question remained. If Crow was dead, where was Langston? Autumn rolled in slow and red across Kentucky. Life returned to its measured rhythm. The harvest, the fairs, the church bells on Sunday mornings. Yet beneath that calm surface, remnants of the Dalton story clung to the county like a stubborn shadow. Travelers sometimes claimed to see lights flicker near the old Homestead foundation. Lanterns, maybe, or fireflies. Others said it was only the memory of what had burned there once. For Sheriff Morgan, the case became a private ghost, one he carried long after others forgot. Each year on the anniversary of the massacre, he rode out to where the house once stood. He'd dismount, remove his hat, and stand quietly. He never prayed aloud. He just looked across the empty land and thought about the family, whose names the world only remembered for one night of horror. But that 3rd year, when he made his visit, something new awaited him. A bundle, left at the edge of the property stone. Inside was a letter sealed in wax. The handwriting was neat, the message brief. "Debts settle in blood, Sheriff. You still owe yours." No signature followed. But the wax bore an imprint, the same initials as the cufflink found in the ash EL. When the letter arrived, Sheriff Morgan knew 2 things for certain. 1, the fire at the Dalton homestead had not consumed the truth. And 2, whoever Everett Langston truly was, he hadn't finished with Hardin County. Morgan sat alone that night in his small office, the edges of the letter curling beneath the heat of the oil lamp. Debts settle in blood. The words pulsed in his mind, stubborn as a bruise. He folded it carefully and locked it away in his desk drawer next to the blue cloth scrap, the only 2 relics left of a story that refused to die. Days passed, but the sense of looming danger sharpened with each sunrise. Reports came from farmers along Hollow Creek Road. A man seen in the fields after sundown, sometimes on horseback, sometimes standing still near the fence line, always in dark clothes. No one could describe his face clearly. Some thought it was Morgan himself out on patrol. Others whispered it was the ghost of Henry Dalton, back to haunt what remained of his land. Morgan didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in warnings. By mid-September, a wagon disappeared along that same road. A widow named Beatrice Hammond and her 2 sons. Their tracks led somewhere near the old Dalton property, but stopped just short of the creek. When volunteers searched, they found the wagon overturned, the contents scattered. No sign of the family. The door to the root cellar on the former Dalton land was open when they arrived, though no one admitted to touching it. What they did find inside, buried beneath loose soil, was a gunpowder crate, empty but still reeking of sulfur and smoke. The initials on the side read Ellen Cumber Louisville, Langston and Company. Sheriff Morgan knew then that Langston was back, or someone working under his shadow. He demanded a search party of 20 men, but the mayor refused. "The county's done bleeding over that land," he snapped. "Let sleeping devils rest." So Morgan went alone. Hollow Creek meandered through old forest, Sycamores twisted into pale claws, the air thick with rot from autumn leaves. The Dalton ruins were nearly gone now, half swallowed by weeds. The only thing left standing was the stone chimney, blackened but unyielding. Morgan dismounted and tied his horse to a fence post. The smell hit him first, a faint, sweet rot that clung to the air like regret. He drew his revolver and stepped closer. At the base of the chimney lay the remains of a small fire, fresh, not more than a day old. Nearby, boot prints sank deep into the mud, running from the creek toward the cellar. Inside he found straw bedding, a broken lantern, and a crate of bullets marked Door 44. Someone was living here, watching, waiting. As he studied the scene, something snapped behind him, the crunch of a stick. He turned, revolver raised. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, one hand resting on a walking cane, the other hidden beneath a coat. The face, now older and thinner, sent a chill through Morgan. "Langston," he said flatly. The man smiled. "You've aged, Sheriff. You should have burned with that house," Langston laughed softly. "And rob you of closure. Now I came back for what's mine." Morgan took a step closer. "And what's that?" "Balance," Langston said. "The Daltons took my fortune. I took their lives, but one of them still walks." He adjusted his hat, eyes gleaming in the half-light. "Robert Dalton." The name struck like a hammer. "Robert's dead. I saw his body." "You saw what I wanted you to see," Langston hissed. "That night I spared him. Told him if he ran, I'd kill the rest again and again until he begged for mercy. He's out there, Sheriff. He's been running from me ever since." Morgan lowered his gun slightly. "Why come back?" Langston stepped forward. "Because the past rots if left unattended. I clean what I start." Before Morgan could reply, a bullet tore through the air, striking the dirt between them. Langston dove for cover behind the chimney, returning fire. Morgan dropped to his knee, fanned 2 quick shots, forcing Langston back. The echo rolled through the trees, scattering crows into the grey sky. Then mild silence. Finally, footsteps approached from the woods. Langston turned his gun toward the sound. A lean figure emerged, a man in torn clothes, mud-streaked face, one arm bandaged. Robert Dalton. His eyes were not the boys Morgan remembered, but those of someone carved by exile. He raised a rifle, trembling but steady. "You took everything," Robert said. Langston aimed, his voice steady as stone. "So finish it, boy. Become me." The shot rang out once. Langston's body jerked backward, slamming against the chimney before collapsing. The revolver slid from his hand. For several seconds, the only sound was the wind through the dead cornstalks. Morgan stood, lowering his own weapon. Robert dropped the rifle, his chest heaving. "I didn't mean to," he murmured, staring at his shaking hands. Morgan approached slowly. "You did what had to be done." But Robert's gaze was far away on something Morgan couldn't see. "He said debts never end," Robert whispered. "That there's always someone who collects." Langston's lifeless eyes watched them both, still half smiling. The sheriff crouched and checked his pockets. No papers, no coins, nothing but a small leather notebook inside his coat. On the first page was a neat list of names. Henry Dalton, Margaret Dalton, William Dalton, Clara Dalton, Beatrice Hammond. Each name had been crossed out. Below them, written in fresh ink, was one more, Grant Morgan. The sheriff folded the notebook and pocketed it. "This never leaves my sight," he said. He turned to Robert. "You need to come with me." "We'll clear your name." Robert didn't answer. When Morgan turned again, the young man was already gone, vanished into the trees beyond Hollow Creek. Only the rustle of leaves marked his passing. The sheriff called his name, but the forest swallowed the sound. Langston's death was ruled self-defense. Morgan filed the report himself. The widow Hammond and her children were never found. The Dalton land was finally fenced off, marked abandoned by county order. But those who passed near Hollow Creek at dusk claimed they saw a lone figure walking the ridgeline. Coat torn, rifle slung low, a young man who never looked back. That fall, when Morgan reread Langston's notebook, he paused on the list of names again. The final one still haunted him, his own. He wondered as he closed the cover whether debts like these ever truly ended, or whether they simply changed hands until no one remembered who owed whom. Winter came, and snow buried the scars of that land once more. But beneath it the soil kept its secrets, and in the silence between the wind and the creek, The echoes of that night, gunfire, shouts, a child's cry, still seemed to linger, as if Kentucky itself refused to forget the blood that once fed its earth. By the winter of 1875, Hardin County was quieter, but quiet didn't mean peace. Word of Everett Langston's death spread slowly, carried on rumor and speculation. Some called Morgan a hero, others whispered he'd struck a deal with the devil himself. The Dalton Homestead, now reduced to frozen rubble, stood as a scar in the snow, a place the wind refused to cross. Yet beneath that stillness something continued to stir, and Sheriff Grant Morgan could feel it pressing down on him like an unspoken confession. He hadn't seen Robert Dalton since that day by Hollow Creek. Weeks had passed, then months, and every lead vanished into hills and rivers. Some said Robert fled west to Missouri. Others swore they saw him begging rides from traders headed north. Morgan suspected none of it was true. He believed deep down that Robert hadn't run far. Some wounds, after all, never leave the soil where they're made. Life in Elizabethtown returned to its slow rhythm. Markets, church bells, births, deaths. But Morgan's nights belonged to ghosts. He rarely slept, and when he did, his dreams carried him back to that ruined house. The sound of dishes breaking, the silence afterward, and always the faint image of Clara's small hand clutching the linen. He'd wake in a cold sweat, sit by his desk and light his oil lamp, staring at the single relic that tethered him to the case, Langston's notebook. Every so often he'd read it again, hoping some overlooked clue might appear. The list inside remained the same, but the meaning grew heavier with time. The crossed-out names no longer looked like victims. They looked like debts paid. He began to wonder if Langston's operation wasn't simply one of collection and extortion, but something far deeper, more systematic. Each name connected somehow. Families ruined by bad seed sales, neighbors forced into deals they couldn't afford, lives destroyed under the guise of contracts forged in good faith. Langston hadn't just killed, he'd curated despair. Morgan set out quietly to trace the network. Each trip took him farther from town. Small farms, borders of neighboring counties, dusty ledgers buried in courthouses. What he found chilled him. Initials of EL and Cupboard turned up again and again, tied to fraudulent loans and harvest shortages going back a decade. Families gone missing, bankruptcies followed by fires. It was all too organized to be luck. There was a machine behind Langston's cruelty, and he'd been only one gear in its grinding jaws. One fogged morning, Morgan met with a clerk from the Louisville Department of Records, a young man shaking from nerves. The clerk hesitated before pulling a sealed file from his desk. Inside were company documents signed not by Everett Langston, but by a name Morgan had never seen before. Samuel Crow. The sheriff froze. The surname was familiar. "Relation to Matthew Crow?" he asked. The clerk nodded quickly. "Brother." Both connected to the same account. Crow vanished 2 years ago, presumed dead. "But look," he slid another page forward, one bearing a fresh signature dated only 3 months ago. The signature read Crow. Morgan's gut turned to ice. Whoever Langston had worked for, they were still out there, alive, continuing the trade. The sheriff leaned back, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "Where was this signed?" he asked quietly. The clerk flipped through the log. Henderson County, near the river crossing. Henderson lay almost 100 miles west, a long ride through difficult terrain, but Morgan didn't hesitate. He left the next morning under a gray sky. The journey took 2 days. On the road, every farmhouse reminded him of the Daltons. Tired roofs, silent fences, lives one missed payment away from ruin. By the time he reached Henderson, he'd become a man chasing not just justice, but absolution. He found the address listed on the form, an abandoned warehouse near the river docks, soot-marked and leaning from age. Horses had been tied there recently. Tracks pressed deep in the mud. He knocked once, then again, no answer. When he forced the door, the smell of mold and tobacco hit him like a wall. A faint light flickered inside from a lantern left on a desk. Papers covered the table. Receipts, shipping manifests, account books full of false names and coded entries. And there beside them sat the half-finished draft of another contract. Lease of Dalton property, resettlement agreement. In that single page, Morgan understood the truth Langston had hinted at. The Daltons hadn't been random victims of temper or pride. They'd been displaced, Their land had value for something more than corn or wheat, and Langston's men wanted it all cleared. Henry had resisted, probably fought back, and the massacre that followed was part of the cleanup. The family's tragedy was a business ledger disguised as bloodshed. He was still staring at the document when the door creaked behind him. Footsteps slow and measured. He turned, hand instinctively going to his revolver. Out of the dim stepped a man whose face was both new and hauntingly familiar. Older, heavier, but with the same sharp grey eyes that Crow once carried. "You must be Morgan," the man said, his tone dry, respectful, almost amused. "My brother spoke of you." "Samuel Crow," Morgan said. Crow smiled faintly. "You've been following quite a trail." "Dead men tend to leave one." "Then perhaps you should stop chasing them," Crow replied. "It's dangerous walking in graves." Morgan's hand tightened around the revolver. "You're running what Langston started." "No," Crow said, stepping closer. "Langston worked for me. He got sloppy, greedy, emotional. I'm not burdened by such sentiment." "You killed the Daltons." Crow shook his head slowly. "We removed an obstacle. The details are unfortunate, but the outcome was necessary. You of all men should understand how progress is built." Morgan's temper burned through his restraint. "You call that progress?" Crow sighed. "You should have left it buried." He moved first. It was a flicker of metal, a shot cracking the silence. The lantern shattered, spraying fire across the table. Morgan dropped to his knee and fired back. Smoke choked the air. Wood splintered. He crawled behind a crate as another bullet tore into the wall beside him. Flames licked upward, devouring the paper trail Crow had built. Then came a single sound outside, and hooves. Someone else had ridden close. A figure burst through the doorway, weapon drawn. "Don't move!" The voice was rough, worn, unmistakable. Robert Dalton. Morgan froze, shielding his face from the rising glow. Robert didn't hesitate. 2 shots rang in quick succession. Crow staggered backward, struck in the chest, the surprise still frozen on his face as he fell, the warehouse filled with crackling firelight. Robert tossed Morgan a glance. "You said debts don't end," he muttered. "Maybe this one does." They dragged what papers they could out before the roof gave in. By dawn, nothing but black smoke rose above the river. Crow's empire, at least in Kentucky, had burned to ash. Morgan sat by the bank after sunrise, exhausted, staring at the ember-lined sky. Robert hovered nearby, hollow-eyed but calm at last. "What happens now?" he asked. "Nothing," Morgan said quietly. "You go, disappear for good. And you?" The sheriff looked at the smoldering wreck. "I'll file a report that the warehouse burned in an accident." "That's where it ends," Robert nodded, then turned to leave. When he mounted his horse, he paused once more. "You were right," he said without looking back. "Silence weighs more than guilt." Morgan watched until the figure disappeared into the mist. Then he stood, pocketing the charred fragment of paper that had survived the blaze. The last line of an unfiled document reading simply, "Land cleared, settlement complete." He tore it into pieces and let them sink into the river. That winter, the Dalton case was finally closed. But every time the sheriff crossed Hollow Creek, he'd glance toward the barren land where the homestead once stood and see, in his mind, that same quiet fire still burning, the one no river could ever truly put out. By the spring of 1876, Grant Morgan was a man ghosts had learned to recognize. Though the Dalton affair was closed in every legal record, it lived on in him like a fever. The edges of his days blurred, his meals untouched, his reports brief and vague. To the townsfolk, he was still the steady hand of Hardin County, the voice that kept order when whiskey and pride boiled over. But in his eyes something had changed. Every dawn, when the mist rolled across the fields and the sun bled faintly through it, he saw the Dalton land. Burned, empty, yet alive with echoes, he tried guilt for a while to move on. But letters kept arriving. The first came in May, written in the same tidy hand that had once marked Langston's ledger. "Consider your silence part of the debt," it said. No signature. The second arrived midsummer, a single page with only 4 words. "We remember your sins." The third followed autumn's first chill, sealed with wax bearing the faintest imprint of a crow's foot. This time the note didn't threaten. It invited. Come to Hollow Creek, midnight. Morgan didn't hesitate. He'd spent too long living beneath questions. He saddled his horse before dusk and rode west, the dying light bleeding across the hillsides. The air carried that strange sweetness again, the kind that hinted at rot and old fires. When he reached the ridge above the Dalton property, moonlight washed the land in dull silver. The chimney still stood, though half collapsed now. Weeds climbed the stone like hands pulling it down. He waited. For a long time nothing happened except the whisper of wind through the trees. Then another sound joined, soft, rhythmic. Footsteps. From the line of sycamores across the field, a figure emerged, cloak flowing behind. Morgan's fingers tensed on his revolver, but the voice that cut through the night was calm, low, and unmistakably human. "You came." The figure stepped into the light. It wasn't Robert Dalton. It wasn't Crow or Langston reborn. It was a woman. She was tall, pale from travel, her dark coat dusted with road dirt. Her face was marked by resolve, not fear. "My name is Evelyn Crow," she said plainly. "Samuel's widow." Morgan felt his stomach tighten. "I buried him myself," she continued. "Or what was left after you and that boy set the warehouse ablaze. If you came for vengeance," he said, "you're late. There's nothing left to take." Evelyn shook her head. "You misunderstand. I came for truth." Morgan watched her carefully. "Your husband was running a network of fraud and murder." "Yes," she said. "And do you think he built it alone? Men like Langston and Samuel don't weave such chains by themselves. They were hired within larger hands. Ones you helped." The sheriff stiffened. "I helped?" "You signed the Dalton property release," she replied, voice sharp as broken glass. "The county seal bore your name, didn't it?" He said nothing, though his breath faltered. The memory crawled back, a document he had indeed stamped months before the massacre, among dozens of property records processed that winter. He'd signed it without reading, trusting the paperwork that passed through his desk. That single act had granted rights of reclamation to E. Langston and Partners. The law itself had cleared the Daltons off their land before a single shot was fired. "I didn't know," he said. Evelyn studied him. "That never absolves a man. You became part of it the moment ink touched that page." Silence drew heavy between them. The wind rattled through the hollow chimney. Morgan lowered his gaze. "If you came for penance, I can't give it. If you came for blood, you'll find I'm ready." Evelyn smiled faintly, but not kindly. "I didn't come to kill you, Sheriff. I came to show you what comes next." From beneath her coat, she drew a folded document and handed it to him. He unfolded it, eyes scanning the page. It was another contract, newer, bearing the watermark of the very county he served. The name at the top made his hands shake. Acquisition Morgan Farmstead. The signatory line bore an ornate scrawl below it. E. Crow. "I've bought your land," she said. "Your past is being written in the same ink you once thought harmless. What burns once, burns twice." Morgan looked up slowly, the paper trembling in his grasp. "What do you want?" "Nothing you can give," she murmured. "I only wanted you to know the circle now closes where it began." She turned to go. But as she stepped into the shadows, she paused. "You'll see them again, you know. The Daltons, every time you close your eyes." Then she was gone. Morgan stood there for what felt like hours, staring down at the contract until the letters blurred. The shame, the weight, the slow collapse of everything he thought moral, it pressed on him like the Kentucky night sky itself. He rode back to town before dawn, his revolver heavy on his hip, guided only by the slow rhythm of hoofbeats through frozen mud. The next morning, they found him at his desk. A single sheet lay before him, his handwriting neat and deliberate. No explanations, no defense, only a confession. "I signed the paper that condemned them. I buried their truth beneath my name. May the earth remember what I tried to forget." His badge rested beside it. Outside, the sun rose pale and indifferent. For years afterward, the story lingered. They said Hardin County's sheriff died a man who couldn't outrun his own ledger. They buried him on a hill above Hollow Creek, not far from the Dalton graves. A simple stone marked the spot. No title, no scripture. Only a single word etched deep into the granite. Silence. And in every year that followed, when the first snow fell and the wind turned east, folks swore they could still hear a horse pacing near the old Dalton field. Slow, steady, waiting, the weary rhythm of a man searching, long after the truth had already found him. Years passed after Sheriff Grant Morgan's death, but the shadow of his choices never left Hardin County. The Dalton massacre became less a story and more a warning. something whispered by candlelight when storms rattled the shutters, a tale told to children to scare them away from greed and pride. But for those who had lived through the blood and ruin, it wasn't folklore. It was memory woven deep into the land. By 1881, the Dalton property had been sold again, this time to a railroad company expanding westward. The surveyors arrived carrying maps and optimism, their boots crunching over the fields once soaked in crimson frost. They saw only opportunity. The soil was fertile, the creek close, the terrain flat enough for iron tracks to slice straight through. To them it was business. To everyone else it was desecration. The workers built a small camp near the ridge where the farmhouse once stood. They cleared weeds, leveled earth, and dug trenches. None of them had ever heard the full story, but locals tried to warn them. "That land remembers," an old man had said. The foreman only laughed. Land don't remember. Men do. But before long even he began to doubt. On their third week, one worker vanished, a quiet lad from Bowling Green named Joseph Tully. His bedroll was still there, his dinner untouched, but his boots lay pointed toward the creek. They searched for 2 days and found nothing, until they noticed a narrow trail of prints leading to the old chimney foundation. There in the mud lay a single glove and a set of rusted shackles, half buried. The men felt uneasy, but the foreman blamed superstition. The boy ran off. Simple as that, yet the mood shifted. At night, the workers spoke of soft knocks echoing near the tree line, of footsteps pacing the ridge, of faint voices carried by the wind. Lanterns flickered for no reason, tents collapsed without wind. Some said they glimpsed movement near the ruins, a man on horseback dismounting only to fade into the dark. No one admitted fear, but by the week's end none would sleep alone. In the town, older folk said it was the sheriff, riding restless in the afterlife, or Robert Dalton returning to guard what was once his. Others said the earth itself was simply tired, too heavy with unburied truth. Whatever the reason, the workers finished just enough of the line to connect the county before the company abruptly stopped construction, citing unsustainable terrain. Quietly the crews packed their tools and left, leaving the half-built rail to sink into weeds and mud. Years later, locals began calling that unfinished stretch the Sheriff's Line. As the land reclaimed itself, Hardin County moved deeper into the new century, but progress came without peace. The courthouse burned in 1890, taking most county records with it, including the Dalton files. The official cause, faulty wiring. The unofficial belief, some things refused to stay documented. By then, no living witness of the massacre remained, but the story survived in fragments, diaries, rumors, and one surviving letter found among Morgan's effects decades later. It was addressed to "Whoever keeps the light," written in a shaky hand. If memory is a curse, it is one I earned. I thought silence would bury guilt, but it only bred its echo. I am part of every wrong done upon this land. Do not build on it. Do not cleanse it. Let it rest. Some debts end only when they are left unpaid. The letter was dated 2 weeks before his death, in 1904, when a group of schoolchildren stumbled upon a rusted badge near Hollow Creek. The teacher reported it to the county office. No one could identify its origin until an archivist polished the surface and saw the faint engraving. GM. For a moment, the story of the sheriff returned to life. Newspapers called it the unearthed legend of the Dalton tragedy. Old wounds reopened. People visited the site again, desperate to touch history, to feel something from the past rise through the soil. Some left flowers, others simply stared in silence, as if expecting the land to speak. But the earth offered no apologies. It only held what it was given. Over time, rain buried the relics again. The badge vanished. The broken rail rusted into the ground. Trees grew through the ruins, their roots curling around stone as though protecting it. Each generation knew less of the truth, smoothing its rough edges into morality tales, stories of sin, redemption, or divine retribution. Yet beneath the myths, the old facts waited, steady and unbending. In the spring of 1921, a journalist from Louisville named Henry Collins came to Hardin County chasing that very truth. He was writing a book about forgotten crimes of the Reconstruction era and had followed rumors of the Dalton case for months. Locals tolerated him politely but avoided his questions. They'd built a life out of forgetting. And this man, with his notebook and city manners, threatened to unearth what the town had agreed to bury. Collins camped near the old Dalton field, spending nights in a small tent close to the creek. He took photographs, scribbled notes, and interviewed anyone still willing to speak. But it wasn't until his fourth night there that something changed. He wrote in his journal, the last entry found later on his body, heard hooves at midnight, thought it was wind, then saw light moving near the ridge, yellow, slow, steady, like a lantern in someone's hand. Couldn't have been more than 30 yards away. The following morning his campsite was empty. The tent flapped in the rain. The camera sat abandoned near the ashes of his fire, its last glass plate showing only a blurred image. A streak of light curved like a riding lantern, and, faintly beside it, the outline of a man wearing a brimmed hat. The photograph became famous across the state. Spiritualists claimed it was Morgan's ghost, restless for confession. Skeptics said it was lightning captured mid-flash. But in Hardin County no one argued. They simply nodded, closed their shutters earlier that night, and spoke a little softer near Hollow Creek. By the turn of the century's second half, the Dalton story had faded again, surviving only in a few local journals and the kind of hush reserved for uneasy truths. The railroad was never completed. The field was never sold again. Travelers who crossed through on warm evenings sometimes claimed to hear a faint clinking of reins, like a horse tethered somewhere unseen, or the echo of boots pacing gravel. Always slow, always steady, and every so often, when the air was stillest and the moon nearest full, farmhands returning late from town would glance toward the ridge and swear they saw him, a lone rider beneath the sycamores. Head bowed, lantern swinging gently in his hand, the sheriff, keeping vigil over a land that never forgot. In the autumn of 1952, almost 80 years after the Dalton massacre, the last direct tie to the events of that winter still lived. An old man named Robert Dalton. For decades people doubted he even existed, believing he had died the same night as his family, or vanished into the West. But age, isolation, and guilt have a way of revealing themselves eventually. He resurfaced not in Kentucky, but in a sleepy Tennessee town just across the border, living under the name Robert Hensley. He was 86 then, frail but clear-eyed. Locals described him as polite, quiet, and unnervingly watchful. He tended a small plot of land outside town, spending his evenings sitting under a crooked oak tree that overlooked the hills. Few knew his past until a young historian named Caroline Briggs arrived from the University of Louisville, researching a project on forgotten Reconstruction-era trade crimes. She came looking for records of Langston and Co., and stumbled upon something far more personal. The town's census led her to Robert's doorstep. When he opened the door, the afternoon light caught the scars along his hand, thin, pale lines that trembled as he gripped the frame. "I'm not who you think I am," he said before she even spoke. Caroline smiled kindly. "I'm not here to hurt you, Mr. Hensley. I just want to listen." It took days before he agreed to talk. They met under that oak tree each evening, as the light faded over the ridges. His voice trembled with age, but his memory remained unyielding, sharp in places, cloudy in others. What Caroline pieced together from those conversations would become the only first-hand account of what happened after the Dalton killings. According to him, he never fled that night. "I hid beneath the cellar," he whispered. "I heard everything, every word, every sound. I heard my father shout. I heard the shots. Then, I heard silence." He paused, eyes distant. "When it ended, someone walked down. Boots on the steps. Not my father's, he was humming. I remember that. He opened the hatch, looked straight at me and smiled. Said debts settled. Then he shut it and walked away. By the time Robert climbed out, the house was burning. He said he carried only Clara's doll when he escaped through the orchard and followed the creek until dawn. He wandered for days, half mad with fever and grief, until a family in Nelson County took him in. He never told them his name. I thought if I forgot it long enough it'd stop hurting. When Caroline asked why he never came forward, his answer was simple. No one wants truth when the lie is cleaner. Over the weeks that followed, Robert grew frail. His health declined, but the act of speaking seemed to grant him a strange peace. One afternoon, Caroline found him waiting on his porch, a bundle wrapped in worn cloth on his lap. Inside lay a half-burned notebook, Sheriff Morgan's notebook, the same one presumed lost in the courthouse fire of 1890. "He gave it to me," Robert said softly. "Said one day I'd know when to show it." The notebook's contents stunned her. Beyond the names and the lists were Morgan's final notes, rough thoughts scrawled in fading ink. In one passage, the sheriff wrote, "The men behind Langston are many, but their wealth will bury the truth. I cannot stop them. I can only ensure the story remains, however twisted it becomes." And below that, one more line added later in steadier handwriting, "Robert lives. He is my last witness." Caroline realized that Robert's survival hadn't been an accident. Morgan had known, maybe even protected it by altering the coroner's reports. The truth had waited, sleeping under another name for half a century. Robert passed away that winter in his sleep. When Caroline cleared his house, she found one last note beside his bed. "Tell them what silence costs." She did. Her book, The Hollow Creek Affidavit, was published in 1954. It never became a bestseller, but it stirred quiet discomfort across Kentucky's old counties. It exposed Langston's financial web, the collusion of local officials, and the names of companies that had profited from erasing the Daltons. It also humanized Morgan, not as a hero, but as a man who bled from the stain he helped create. The site of the Dalton Homestead became a historical reserve 2 decades later, though most visitors came only for the story, not the lesson. They'd walk along the old field, now overgrown and scattered with wildflowers. The crushed stones of the chimney still stood, stubborn as memory. A plaque marked the spot, plain bronze polished by decades of rain. It read The Dalton Homestead, 1874. Tragedy breeds remembrance. Here stood a family lost to greed and silence. May history never repeat what happened in these walls. Locals said that when the wind rose from the creek, the air carried faint smells of smoke and pine. And occasionally, on moonlit nights, those who lingered too long near the ridge swore they saw the same figure the workers once described, a rider astride a dark horse, moving slow, lantern glowing like the ember of a confession that never burned out. Some said it was Sheriff Grant Morgan, still patrolling his unending guilt. Others believed it was Robert Dalton, guarding the memory his family died to preserve. But those who truly listened, those who stood quietly under the sycamores and felt the chill of history at their backs, often spoke of something else entirely. They said the land felt aware, that in the hush between crickets and breeze, if you whispered a name, any name lost to time, the wind would answer softly, carrying it away as if welcoming it home. Caroline Briggs died in 1991, leaving her field notes to the State Archive. In the margins of her last entry, she had written one simple sentence, unconnected to any project, perhaps an echo from those evenings under the oak tree. Some haunted places keep no ghosts, only memory, and memory is far harder to silence. To this day, Hollow Creek remains untouched, the railway unfinished, the fields left fallow. The only sign marking the way is an old wooden post, rotted and splintered, bearing a single name carved by an unknown hand over a century ago, Morgan. At sunset, light falls just right across the letters, making them glow gold for a moment before fading into grey, a final reminder that history does not burn, it only smoulders, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover what the silence tried to bury. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.